California, 1875. Gold no longer glitters on these hills, the dreams of fortune have been dulled by loss. The streets are quieter, heavy with the shadows of men left underground in collapsed tunnels, of husbands and fathers lost not just to pickaxes and prospecting, but to violence, fever, and hunger. Silence echoes in the homes of Millbrook, a town lying at the edge of a vast, restless world. Women stand in these empty thresholds, mothers, sisters grappling with loneliness so powerful it stains the walls. Their children cry at night for men who will never return. There are too many funerals and not enough answers, but something new begins to stir in this atmosphere of mourning or rumor. A promise, a whisper behind closed doors. Word spreads that a mysterious woman has arrived. She's known as Madame Evangeline Mortis, a spiritualist whose eyes shine silver in the candlelight, whose voice slides into the soul like a gentle hand clasping your heart. Inside her sanctuary of eternal peace, a great Victorian house, draped in velvet and shadow, Mortis claims she speaks for the other side. She promises more than comfort. She promises connection. The living can speak to their dead. Grieving mothers may hear the voices of lost children. Young widows might receive messages from the husbands who vanished into the ground. The bereaved begin to gather. They come quietly, uncertain, drawn by curiosity, pulled by hope. They arrive at the sanctuary's wide porch under cover of dusk, carrying with them faded lockets, hand-stitched blankets, letters never answered. Some clutch coins, the last reminder that their husband's labor once sustained them. In the dimness of the front parlor, Mortis welcomes them. Her words are gentle, her movements commanding. To some, she's a prophet, to others, a fraud. But here, in this moment, she is all they have. Shadows dance across her face as she prepares for the evening seance. Drawing thick velvet curtains closed against the outside world, the seance begins. Cold air seems to rise from the floor. Mortis's voice drops low, hypnotic. She asks each woman about her grief, her children, her secrets. She listens and learns. Then, when the room is quiet as a tomb, she begins to speak. There are souls here tonight, they linger, longing for peace. They have messages for the faithful. Mothers hold their breath. Widows tremble. The air grows heavier, charged with unseen electricity. First, Mortis relays gentle reassurances, a husband's love, a child's laughter heard from beyond the veil. The widows weep, overcome by memory, but this comfort is only the beginning. Eventually, her messages change. They grow urgent, then dark. For Sarah Henderson, a mother of three, Mortis's voice becomes possessed by sorrow. Your suffering in this world is temporary, Sarah, but your children's suffering will be eternal unless you do what is merciful. Sarah recoils, uncertain. Mortis leans closer, her eyes blazing. They are marked for futures of poverty, of sin, of ruin. Only through divine mercy can you save them. Those words echo through the sanctuary. Other mothers begin to wonder, could this be true? Could love demand something unthinkable? But grief is a powerful force. It blurs judgment, twists faith, transforms hope into fear. Days become weeks. Mortis listens, advises, manipulates. She introduces her doctrine of divine mercy, a twisted theology that claims death can be a blessing, that releasing a child from this world is an act of supreme devotion. She supports her doctrine with scripture selecting verses, distorting meaning. Suffer the little children to come unto me, she says, voice humming with authority. The mothers nod, bewildered, desperate to believe. One by one, they begin to isolate themselves. Mortis persuades them to move into the sanctuary. She cuts their ties to skeptical friends and distant relatives. She tells them the spirits grow angry at outsiders, that only true believers may remain. Night after night, the seances stretch until dawn. Sleep deprivation gnaws at their resistance. The mothers grow tired, fragile, alone among strangers who echo Mortis's every word. In the deepest hours, the time when grief is strongest, when hope seems unreachable, Mortis delivers her strongest revelation. She claims God himself has spoken. Some children, she says, are destined for suffering. Their only salvation is early entrance to heaven. The mothers hesitate, horror battling against faith. Can it be? Is this truly what the spirits want? Mortis is relentless, comforting, persuasive. She promises that the children will not feel pain, that their souls will rejoice. And so the stage is set for tragedy. Sarah Henderson becomes the first whose faith, loneliness, and despair turns her hand toward murder, guided every step by the unyielding influence of the woman who claims to speak for God. But this is just the beginning. The streets of Millbrook wait in ignorance as a web of darkness spreads within the sanctuary. In the next chapters, you'll witness how Madame Evangeline Mortis transforms comfort into control, faith into fear, and loving mothers into instruments of death in the name of divine mercy. Welcome back to our investigation into one of the most chilling cases in American history. In Chapter 1, we entered the shadowed world of the Sanctuary of Eternal Peace, where Madame Evangeline Mortis began weaving her web of psychological control over grieving widows. Now we witness how that web tightened into a noose not just around the mothers, but around their innocent children. The spring of 1875 arrives cold and merciless in Millbrook. Inside the sanctuary, Sarah Henderson has been living for 6 weeks now, her 3 children sleeping in cramped quarters while she spends her nights in endless vigils with Mortis. The other women whisper about Sarah in the corridors, how she's grown thin, how her eyes have taken on a glassy, distant quality, how she speaks only of divine messages and heavenly mercy. But Sarah doesn't hear their whispers. Her world has narrowed to a single point of focus, the voice of Madame Mortis, which she believes carries the wisdom of eternity itself. Modern psychologists would recognize what's happening to Sarah as systematic psychological conditioning, a process so insidious that the victim becomes complicit in their own destruction. But in 1875, such understanding doesn't exist. There are no terms for what Mortis is doing, no framework for recognizing the manipulation. Mortis begins each day before dawn, when the mind is most vulnerable. She wakes Sarah for private prayer sessions, claiming the spirits prefer the quiet hours when the veil between worlds grows thin. Sleep-deprived and emotionally raw, Sarah becomes increasingly susceptible to suggestion. "Your husband visited me again last night," Mortis whispers in the candlelit parlor. "He's deeply troubled, Sarah. He speaks of your daughter Mary with such sorrow." Her old Mary Henderson, a bright-eyed child with curls like spun gold and a laugh that once filled their modest cabin. Now she seems different to Sarah, tainted somehow by the shadows Mortis claims to see in her future. "What does he say?" Sarah asks, her voice barely audible. Mortis places a cold hand on Sarah's wrist. "He sees her path, dear one. A life of corruption awaits. Disease will claim her beauty, poverty will break her spirit, and sin will devour her soul. She's marked, Sarah, marked for suffering that would make her father weep for eternity." The words burrow into Sarah's exhausted mind like parasites. During the day, when Mary plays with her rag doll or helps tend the sanctuary's garden, Sarah watches her with growing dread. She begins to see signs of this supposed corruption. The child's natural curiosity becomes willfulness. Her innocent questions become defiance. Mortis reinforces these perceptions with carefully constructed scenarios. She arranges for Mary to be caught taking an extra biscuit from the kitchen. "See how greed already takes root," she observes. When Mary cries during a séance, disrupting the solemnity, notice how darkness speaks through her, rejecting the sacred. Week by week, the psychological pressure intensifies. Mortis introduces Sarah to her doctrine of divine mercy through seemingly innocent Bible study sessions. They read of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, of Jesus' suffering for the salvation of mankind. But under Mortis's interpretation, these stories become justifications for the unthinkable. God sometimes asks the greatest sacrifices from those with the strongest faith, Mortis explains, her voice honey-smooth and hypnotic. Abraham raised the knife because he trusted in divine wisdom. Christ suffered the cross because love demands sacrifice. And sometimes, Sarah, love demands that we release what we hold most dear. Sarah's other child, 6-year-old James and 8-year-old Elizabeth, begin to sense something wrong with their mother. They notice how she stares at Mary with an expression they can't understand, how she separates Mary from their games, how she whispers prayers over the sleeping child's bed. But children trust their mothers implicitly. When Sarah tells them Mary needs special spiritual attention, they accept this explanation without question. When Mary begins sleeping in a separate room, supposedly for her spiritual development, they feel only a vague unease they can't articulate. The isolation of Mary becomes complete. Mortis claims the child's spiritual corruption might contaminate her siblings if they spend too much time together. Sarah, desperate to protect her other children, agrees to keep Mary separated during most waking hours. The psychological conditioning escalates. During nightly vigils that stretch until dawn, Mortis subjects Sarah to what we now recognize as classic brainwashing techniques. She alternates between praise and criticism, comfort and fear, creating emotional dependency. Sarah begins to crave Mortis's approval, to dread her disapproval. Financial control becomes another tool. Sarah signs over her late husband's small savings to the sanctuary, claiming it's for spiritual purification. Now she depends entirely on Mortis for food, shelter, even basic necessities for her children. The economic trap makes escape seem impossible, even if doubt were to creep in. But doubt is carefully managed. Whenever Sarah wavers, Mortis provides just enough comfort to pull her back. A gentle touch, a reassuring word, a promise that Mary's suffering will be brief while her heavenly reward will be eternal. The other women in the sanctuary watch this process with growing unease. But they've been conditioned to. They've learned not to question Mortis's wisdom, not to interfere with divine plans. Some even begin to envy Sarah, chosen for such an important spiritual mission. As April progresses into May, the pressure reaches a crescendo. Mortis claims to receive increasingly urgent messages from Sarah's deceased husband. The window for Mary's salvation is closing, she insists. The forces of darkness grow stronger each day the child remains in this world. She's already beginning to show signs of the corruption Mortis observes during one particularly intense session. Did you see how she looked at that traveling merchant today? The way she smiled? Seduction already stirs in her young heart. Mary's innocent friendliness becomes evidence of future promiscuity. Her childish curiosity about the world beyond the sanctuary becomes proof of rebellious nature. Every normal behavior is twisted into a sign of impending doom. The final psychological assault comes during an all-night vigil on May 14th. Exhausted beyond rational thought, kneels beside Mortis in the darkened seance room. Candles flicker, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air grows cold, and Mortis begins to convulse as if possessed. When she speaks, her voice has changed, deeper, more masculine. Sarah gasps, recognizing what she believes is her husband's voice speaking through the medium. "Sarah, my beloved," the voice says, and Sarah weeps at hearing those familiar endearments. "I've watched you struggle with this burden, and my heart breaks for you. But the time has come. Mary must be sent to me before the darkness claims her completely." The voice describes the method, a special mixture that will ease Mary's transition, ensuring she feels no pain as her spirit rises to heaven. It will appear as natural death, preventing interference from earthly authorities who wouldn't understand divine necessity. "Tomorrow night," the voice commands, "when the moon is dark and the veil is thinnest, you must be strong, my love. You must trust in God's plan." Sarah nods through her tears, her resistance finally shattered. In her sleep-deprived, manipulated state, she believes completely that this is her husband's spirit speaking, that God himself demands this sacrifice. The trap is set. Tomorrow night, 4-year-old Mary Henderson will become the first victim of Madame Mortis's twisted theology. But even as Sarah accepts this horrible mission, she doesn't understand that she's not saving her daughter's soul, she's destroying her own. In the shadows of the sanctuary, other mothers watch and learn. Rebecca Walsh, Agnes Blackwood, Catherine Millsage, wondering if they too might receive such a divine calling. The circle of manipulation expands, drawing more innocents toward the abyss. But Mortis's greatest triumph is also the seed of her eventual downfall, for in demanding the ultimate sacrifice from these mothers, she creates evidence that cannot be hidden forever. Tomorrow night's tragedy will be just the beginning of a killing spree that will shock a nation and ultimately bring justice to Millbrook. The children sleep peacefully tonight, unaware that their mother's love has been weaponized against them. By dawn, one of them will be dead, and the others will be living on borrowed time. May 15th, 1875, a date that will forever mark the transformation of maternal love into an instrument of death. The sun sets red over Millbrook, painting the sky the color of warning, though no one yet understands the omen. Inside the sanctuary of eternal peace, Sarah Henderson moves through her final day as an innocent woman. Tomorrow she will wake as a killer, though she will not understand herself to be one. Mary Henderson, 4 years old, spends her last day alive playing with her ragdoll in the garden. She hums a little song her father used to sing, her voice clear and sweet in the evening air. She doesn't notice how her mother watches from the window with tears streaming down her face, doesn't see the way Sarah's hands shake as she grips the curtain. Madame Mortis observes it all with cold satisfaction. Every tremor of Sarah's resolve, every moment of hesitation, becomes an opportunity for reinforcement. She approaches Sarah in the garden as Mary plays among the roses. "She looks so peaceful, doesn't she?" Mortis says softly. "Innocent, pure. Can you imagine that beautiful child learning to sell her body for coins? Can you picture those sweet hands stained with sin? That voice crying out in pain and degradation?" Sarah shudders, turning away. "Please, don't say such things." "But they must be said," Mortis insists, her voice carrying the authority of divine revelation. "Your husband showed me visions of her future, Sarah, the consumption that will hollow her cheeks, the men who will use her and discard her, the children she bear in shame and abandon in alleys. Is your momentary pain worth her eternal suffering? The psychological manipulation continues throughout the day. Mortis has prepared carefully for this moment, timing each interaction to maximize Sarah's emotional vulnerability. During lunch, she reads scripture about Christ's sacrifice, emphasizing God's love in allowing his Son to suffer for humanity's salvation. During evening prayers, she speaks of the blessed martyrs who chose death over corruption. Remember, Sarah, she whispers as they kneel together, you're not taking life, you're giving eternal life. You're not causing death, you're preventing a fate worse than death. As darkness falls, the other residents of the sanctuary seem to sense something momentous approaching. Conversations grow hushed. Children are put to bed early. Even the candles seem to burn dimmer, as if the very air grows heavy with impending tragedy. Mary has her final dinner, bread and milk, eaten at a small table in the kitchen while her siblings dine with the other families. Sarah can barely look at her daughter, knowing this is their last meal together. When Mary asks why Mama looks sad, Sarah can only stroke her hair and whisper, everything will be better tomorrow, my darling. The preparation begins at 10 o'clock. In her private chambers, Mortis mixes the deadly concoction laudanum, morphine, and other opiates dissolved in sweetened wine. She's perfected this mixture through experimentation on stray animals, calibrating the dosage for a child Mary's size. It will work quickly, she assures Sarah. The child will simply grow drowsy and slip peacefully into eternal sleep. Remember, Mortis instructs as she hands Sarah the small bottle. This is communion wine blessed by the spirits. Mary is receiving the sacrament that will transform her earthly body into a heavenly vessel. You are not giving her poison, you are giving her freedom. Sarah's hands tremble as she takes the bottle. The liquid inside looks innocent enough, deep red like wine, sweet-smelling from the added sugar. It could be medicine for a cough, a bedtime tonic for better sleep. Only its true purpose makes it monstrous. The walk to Mary's room feels endless. Sarah moves through the darkened corridors of the sanctuary like a woman walking in a nightmare, each step taking her further from innocence. Behind her, she imagines she can feel the spirits her husband supposedly dwells among, urging her forward, blessing her mission. Mary's room is small and sparsely furnished. Just a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a table holding a basin for washing. Mary sleeps curled on her side, her rag doll clutched against her chest, her breathing soft and even in the darkness. For a moment, Sarah's resolve nearly breaks. This is her child, her baby, born from her body and nurtured with her love. How can she do this thing? How can any earthly purpose justify what she's about to attempt? But then she remembers Mortis's words, her husband's supposed voice pleading for Mary's salvation. She remembers the visions of corruption and degradation, the promise that this momentary pain will prevent eternal suffering. Her hand steadies on the bottle. Mary, she whispers, gently shaking her daughter's shoulder. Wake up, sweetheart. Mary stirs, blinking in confusion. Mama, is it morning already? No, darling, but I have something special for you. The spirits have sent you a gift, special wine that will make you very happy. Mary sits up, still drowsy but curious. She's always been an obedient child, trusting her mother completely. When Sarah offers her the bottle, she reaches for it without hesitation. It tastes sweet. Sarah lies, knowing the laudanum's bitterness has been masked with sugar. Drink it all down, like a good girl. Mary takes the bottle and drinks. The liquid is thick and syrupy, stronger tasting than she expected, but she trusts her mother's words. She drains the bottle completely, then hands it back with a sleepy smile. Will I dream about Papa? She asks, already beginning to feel the opiate's effects. Yes, darling, Sarah whispers, tears streaming down her face. You're going to see Papa very soon. Mary nods and lies back down, clutching her doll. Within minutes, her breathing begins to slow and deepen. The laudanum works its way through her small system, shutting down her organs one by one. Sarah sits beside the bed, holding her daughter's hand as the child slips away. Mary's skin grows cold, her pulse grows weak, her breath comes in shallow gasps. She doesn't seem to be in pain. The opiates ensure that, but the sight of her daughter dying fills Sarah with a horror beyond description. It's for the best, she whispers to herself, repeating Mortis's words like a prayer. It's for the best. She's going to heaven. She's going to be safe. But even as she says these things, some deep part of Sarah's soul screams in protest. This is wrong. This is murder. This is the destruction of everything sacred about motherhood. By midnight, Mary Henderson is dead. Sarah sits in the darkness for hours, holding her daughter's cooling hand, unable to believe what she's done. The child who yesterday was laughing in the garden now lies still and lifeless. Her dreams ended forever by her mother's hand. Eventually, Mortis comes to check on the deed. She finds Sarah in a state of shock, rocking back and forth beside the bed, murmuring incoherently. "It's done," Mortis says with satisfaction. "The child is free. Her soul soars with the angels while her earthly suffering is ended. You've performed a great act of mercy, Sarah," but Sarah can barely hear the words. The magnitude of what she's done begins to settle over her like a suffocating blanket. She's killed her own child. Whatever justifications led to this moment, the fact remains she's a murderer. Mortis, however, is prepared for this reaction. She wraps Sarah in comfort and reassurance, painting the crime as righteousness, the murder as mercy. She speaks of divine plans and heavenly rewards until Sarah's horror begins to transform into something else, a twisted sense of accomplishment, a perverted pride in having made the ultimate sacrifice for her child's salvation. "You've shown love beyond what most mothers could bear," Mortis tells her. "Your husband is proud of you. God himself smiles upon your faithfulness." By dawn, the transformation is complete. Sarah no longer sees herself as a killer but as a martyred saint, a mother whose love was so pure she was willing to send her child to heaven rather than watch her suffer on earth. The cover-up begins immediately. Mortis has planned for this moment, preparing the story that will hide the truth. Mary died of sudden fever, they'll say, childhood illness, tragically common in these times. No one will question it. Dr. James Morrison arrives to examine the body and sign the death certificate. He finds a child, apparently dead of natural causes, no signs of violence, no obvious symptoms of poisoning. The laudanum has metabolized enough to be undetectable by the crude medical examination techniques of 1875. Summer fever, he concludes, noting the season and the child's peaceful appearance. It takes them quickly sometimes. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Henderson." Sarah nods, playing the role of grieving mother while inside. She believes she's accomplished something holy. The neighbors bring food and flowers, never suspecting that the weeping woman they comfort has murdered her own daughter. Mary Henderson is buried 3 days later in Millbrook's small cemetery. The entire community attends, offering sympathy to the bereaved family. Sarah stands beside the small grave, accepting condolences while Mortis watches from the shadows, already planning her next victim. But this is only the beginning. Sarah's successful transition of her daughter proves to Mortis that her methods work. She can convince loving mothers to kill their children and make it appear natural. The psychological techniques she's perfected, sleep deprivation, religious manipulation, gradual escalation, have transformed maternal love into a weapon of death. In the weeks following Mary's funeral, other mothers in the sanctuary begin to receive their own divine messages. Mortis studies each woman carefully, looking for the perfect combination of grief, desperation, and faith that will make them susceptible to her influence. Rebecca Walsh, who lost her husband to tuberculosis, begins having private sessions where Mortis claims to receive disturbing visions about her twin sons. Agnes Blackwood, whose farming accident left her widowed with 2 children, starts hearing about the special spiritual corruption that marks her daughter for suffering. The circle of manipulation expands. The web grows stronger. And in the small cemetery outside Millbrook, Mary Henderson's grave stands as silent testimony to what happens when faith becomes fanaticism. When love becomes a license for murder, the killing has begun. But the community remains ignorant of the evil spreading through their midst. More children will die before the truth is revealed. More mothers will be transformed into instruments of death by a woman who claims to speak for God but serves only her own twisted hunger for power and control. Summer arrives in Millbrook with unusual heat, as if the very earth burns with fever. 3 weeks have passed since Mary Henderson's funeral, and the town has settled back into its rhythms of quiet grief and daily survival. No one notices the change in Sarah Henderson, how her eyes now hold a glassy satisfaction, how she speaks of her daughter's death as a blessing, rather than a tragedy. But within the walls of the Sanctuary of Eternal Peace, a transformation is taking place. Madame Evangeline Mortis has tasted success, and like all predators, she grows bolder with each kill. The other mothers in the sanctuary whisper among themselves about Sarah's special calling. They've watched her elevated status within Mortis's inner circle, seen how she's treated as a spiritual advisor to newer arrivals. Some feel envious, why wasn't their faith strong enough to receive such divine attention? Others feel afraid, what if they too are called upon to make such sacrifices? Mortis carefully cultivates both emotions. She drops hints about other children marked for divine transition, speaks mysteriously of spiritual visions that reveal which souls are destined for corruption. The mothers begin to examine their own children with new eyes. looking for signs of the spiritual contamination Mortis claims to see. Rebecca Walsh becomes Mortis's second target, a 28-year-old widow whose husband died coughing blood in their small cabin, leaving her with twin sons Thomas and Timothy, both 6 years old. Rebecca arrived at the sanctuary 2 months ago, desperate and penniless, carrying everything she owned in a single carpet bag. The twins are bright, energetic boys who look so alike that even their mother sometimes confuses them. They have their father's dark hair and their mother's gentle nature. Playing quietly together and asking few questions about their changed circumstances. In any normal situation, they would be seen as blessing healthy children who've survived the dangers of frontier childhood. But Mortis doesn't see blessings. She sees opportunities. Twins are spiritually dangerous, she explains to Rebecca during a private consultation in late June. They share a soul bond that creates double vulnerability to dark forces. When one is corrupted, the other inevitably follows. I've seen it before: twin children who drag each other into deeper and deeper sin. Rebecca shifts uncomfortably. But they're good boys. They mind their manners. They help with chores. Now, yes, Mortis agrees. But I've received troubling visions about their future. Would you like me to share what the spirits have shown me? Rebecca nods, though part of her dreads what she might hear. Mortis closes her eyes, placing her hands on Rebecca's shoulders. I see them groan, Rebecca. Thomas leads Timothy into theft, first small things, then larger crimes. They become outlaws, wanted men who terrorize honest folk. Their names become synonymous with violence and fear. And because they share that twin bond, neither can escape the other's influence. They pull each other deeper into darkness until both are damned beyond redemption. The vision is detailed and horrifying. Mortis describes bank robberies, murders, a final shootout where both boys die in their sins, their souls claimed by demons. She speaks with such conviction, such apparent sorrow for Rebecca's future pain, that doubt becomes impossible. But surely, Rebecca whispers, surely there must be some way to save them. Mortis nods slowly. There is one way. If the soul bond between them could be broken before corruption takes hold, one might be saved while the other is transitioned to heavenly protection. The suggestion is subtle but clear. One twin must die to save the other. Rebecca recoils from the thought, but Mortis is patient. She doesn't push for immediate acceptance. Instead, she begins the same process of psychological conditioning that transformed Sarah Henderson from loving mother to killer. Sleep deprivation comes first. Rebecca is awakened before dawn for special prayer sessions, kept up past midnight for intensive spiritual counseling. Her exhausted mind becomes increasingly vulnerable to suggestion. Financial dependency follows. Rebecca signs over her husband's small life insurance payment to the sanctuary, supposedly for spiritual purification. Now she depends entirely on Mortis for food, shelter, even clothing for her sons. Isolation completes the trap. Rebecca is discouraged from socializing with other mothers who might question Mortis's teachings. She's told that her situation is too spiritually delicate for outsiders to understand. Meanwhile, Mortis begins gathering intelligence on the twins, learning their personalities and habits. She discovers that Thomas is slightly more assertive, more likely to speak up or challenge authority. This becomes evidence of his dominant, corrupting influence over his gentler brother. Thomas is the leader, she explains to Rebecca. He's the one who will initiate their criminal partnership. Timothy follows because of the twin bond, but Thomas chooses the path of sin. If Thomas were to be transitioned to heaven before that influence takes hold, Timothy could be saved from following that dark road. The psychological manipulation intensifies throughout July. Rebecca begins to see Thomas's natural leadership as evidence of future criminality. When he suggests games to his brother, she sees criminal planning. When he takes an extra helping of food, she sees the greed that will drive him to robbery. Mortis reinforces these perceptions with carefully staged incidents. She arranges for Thomas to be caught taking a penny from another child's room. See how theft already calls to him, she observes. When Thomas defends Timothy from older children's teasing, notice how violence becomes his first response. By late July, Rebecca has been convinced that Thomas is indeed marked for corruption and that his influence will doom his brother as well. The only loving choice is to send Thomas to heaven before that corruption can take hold. The method is the same as before: laudanum mixed with sweetened wine, administered during a private communion ceremony. Mortis assures Rebecca that Thomas will feel no pain, that his soul will soar free while his earthly body finds peaceful rest. On August 1, 1875, just 2.5 months after Mary Henderson's murder, Thomas Walsh drinks the poisoned communion wine and dies in his sleep. His mother sits beside his bed, holding his hand and whispering prayers until dawn. But Thomas's death proves more traumatic for Rebecca than Mary's was for Sarah. Perhaps it's the nature of twins, a visible evidence of the surviving brother's grief. Timothy wanders the sanctuary, calling for Thomas, unable to understand where his constant companion has gone. He begins having nightmares, stops eating, clings to his mother with desperate intensity. Rebecca sees her surviving son's anguish and begins to doubt. Have she and Mortis made a mistake? Was Thomas's death really necessary? The questions torment her, threatening to crack the psychological conditioning. Mortis recognizes the danger and acts quickly. She tells Rebecca that Timothy's grief is actually relief that his soul recognizes its freedom from Thomas's corrupting influence. The nightmares aren't trauma but purification, the last traces of the twin bond being cleansed from Timothy's spirit. You've saved him, she assures Rebecca. Look how pure his suffering is, how clean his tears. This is the grief of salvation, not loss. But Rebecca's doubt plants seeds of resistance in the other mothers. Some begin to question whether the children's deaths are truly merciful. Others wonder why their own children haven't been chosen. For such divine attention, Mortis realizes she needs to move more quickly. Before doubt can spread and undermine her control, she identifies her next targets: Agnes, Blackwood, and Catherine Mills, and begins their conditioning. Simultaneously, Agnes lost her husband in a farming accident that left him crushed beneath an overturned wagon. She has 2 children, Emma, age 5, and David, age 7. Catherine's husband died in a railroad construction accident, leaving her with 3 children, Robert, 4, Margaret, 6, and John, 9. For Agnes, Mortis creates a narrative about Emma's spiritual corruption, claiming the child is marked for a life of prostitution and disease. For Catherine, she focuses on Robert's supposed destiny as a criminal and murderer. The psychological conditioning accelerates. Both women are subjected to intensive manipulation, isolated from outside influences, and gradually convinced that killing their children is an act of divine mercy. Agnes breaks first. On August 23, 5-year-old Emma Blackwood dies of apparent summer fever. Then Catherine follows. On September 12, 4-year-old Robert Mills is found dead in his bed, another victim of childhood illness. The community begins to notice the pattern. Dr. James Morrison, who signed all the death certificates, starts keeping private notes about the unusual cluster of child deaths. Reverend Samuel Matthews delivers sermons about protecting children and being wary of false prophets. But Mortis isn't finished. She has identified more targets, refined her methods, grown confident in her ability to transform maternal love into an instrument of death. The killing spree that began with Mary Henderson is about to claim even more innocent lives. In the small cemetery outside Millbrook, for small graves now stand in Mary Henderson, Thomas Walsh, Emma Blackwood, and Robert Mills. Their headstones speak of beloved children taken too soon by illness and accident. But beneath the carved words lies a darker truth. These children died because their mothers loved them too much to let them live. The circle of death expands, drawing more victims into its web. And in the shadows of the sanctuary, Madame Evangeline Mortis smiles with cold satisfaction, already planning the next divine transition that will feed her hunger for power and control. But seeds of suspicion are being planted, questions are being asked, and in the surviving children, Timothy Walsh, David Blackwood, Margaret, and John Millstromer begins to manifest in ways that will eventually expose the truth. The reckoning approaches. Though no one yet realizes it, justice moves slowly in small frontier towns. But it moves nonetheless, and for every child who dies in the name of divine mercy, evidence accumulates that will eventually bring Mortis face to face with earthly judgment. November 15, 1875, the night that would finally expose Madame Evangeline Mortis's reign of terror, began like so many others at the Sanctuary of Eternal Peace. But this time, something was different. 8-year-old Helen Sullivan, marked for death by the woman who claimed to speak for God, would refuse to go quietly to her grave. The final victim's resistances, Mortis, prepared to give Mary Sullivan the fatal command to poison her daughter Helen. The intelligent child sensed the approaching danger with an intuition that had kept her alive this long. She had watched too many other children disappear after their mothers began crying in that particular way, had seen too many bottles of dark liquid appear in the night. Helen did something unprecedented. That November evening she ran, slipping out through a window while the adults were engaged in their nightly séance. She took her 5-year-old sister, Patricia, and fled into the dark streets of Millbrook. She had heard enough adult conversations to know where the town doctor lived, and she headed there with desperate determination to find someone who would listen to her. Warnings. Dr. James Morrison was startled awake by frantic knocking on his door. He opened it to find two young girls in nightgowns, the older one holding the younger protectively while both shivered in the cold night air. "Please, sir," Helen gasped. "You have to help us. The lady at the sanctuary gives children poison that makes them die, and she's going to make our mama give it to us next." Morrison initially assumed the girls were having nightmares, but Helen's detailed descriptions of the other children's deaths details she couldn't possibly know unless she'd witnessed them convinced him that something genuinely sinister was occurring at the sanctuary. "She tells the mamas that God wants their children to go to heaven," Helen explained with heartbreaking 80-year-old clarity. "But the children don't want to go. They cry and fight. But the mamas make them drink the bad medicine anyway because she says it's what Jesus wants." The investigation unfolds. Morrison questioned Helen carefully, and her responses revealed a pattern that matched his own growing suspicions about the cluster of child deaths in Millbrook. He realized he must act immediately and took the girls to Sheriff Thomas Bradley's home, insisting that the law enforcement officer hear Helen's testimony. Sheriff Bradley was initially reluctant to take a child's accusations seriously, but Morrison's medical expertise lent credibility to the claims. Together they began piecing together evidence of systematic murder hidden behind the facade of spiritual guidance. Helen's escape triggered Mortis into a panic. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, she felt genuine fear as she realized her operations had been exposed to outside authorities. She began making preparations to leave town, claiming that the spirits had called her to take her ministry elsewhere, but it was too late. Armed with Helen's detailed testimony about the sanctuary's inner workings, Bradley obtained a warrant to search the premises on December 3, 1875. The evidence revealed what investigators found in Mortis's private chambers shocked even hardened frontier lawmen. Hidden away were detailed psychological profiles of each victim's mother, showing calculated exploitation of grief and desperation. Her notes revealed systematic study of human vulnerability, documenting exactly how to break down maternal protective instincts. They discovered her poison laboratory collection of opiates and chemicals used to create the deadly communion wine that killed 8 children. Most damning of all was her private journal, filled with contemptuous observations about the weak fools she manipulated into committing murder. "Pathetic creatures will believe anything if delivered with proper authority," read one entry. "Their grief makes them perfect instruments. Each success proves how easily maternal love can be perverted into its opposite." Catherine Mills, confronted with this evidence, broke down completely and confessed to poisoning her son Robert. Her testimony provided the roadmap investigators needed to understand Mortis's methods of psychological manipulation and control. The trial that shocked a nation. Trial began on February 14, 1876, Valentine's Day in a courtroom expanded to handle unprecedented crowds of observers, journalists, and legal professionals. Prosecutor William Hammond faced the challenge of proving that someone could be held responsible for murders committed by other hands through psychological manipulation. 8 children are dead, Hammond told the jury, because this woman convinced their mothers that murder was mercy, that infanticide was divine will. The prosecution methodically built their case. Dr. Morrison provided medical evidence of systematic poisoning. The surviving children, led by brave Helen Sullivan, described the horror of life inside the sanctuary with heartbreaking clarity. The manipulated mothers testified about their psychological conditioning, each describing the same pattern of isolation, sleep deprivation, and gradual destruction of natural protective instincts. Against her attorney's advice, Mortis insisted on testifying in her own defense. She saw the courtroom as another venue for manipulation, another audience to convince of her divine authority. "I saved those children from lives of corruption and suffering," she declared without remorse. Their mothers understood this. They participated willingly in acts of divine mercy. Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac when God commanded it. These faithful women showed even greater courage. Her testimony revealed the calculating nature of her crimes and her complete absence of genuine remorse. Under cross-examination, she could not explain away the poison laboratory, the psychological profiles, or her journal entries describing her victims with contempt. Justice served. After deliberating for 4.5 hours. The jury returned guilty verdicts on all 8 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Harrison Wells sentenced Mortis to death, condemning her actions in words that reflected the community's horror. "You perverted the sacred trust between parent and child, transforming maternal love into an instrument of death. Your manipulation of grieving mothers represents evil of the deepest kind." On June 15, 1876, Evangeline Mortis was executed by hanging. Even facing death, she maintained her facade of righteousness, declaring, "I stand before you unrepentant, for I have committed no crime save obedience to divine will. History will vindicate my actions." The aftermath and healing. The mothers who had killed their children faced complex consequences. Recognized as victims of manipulation rather than cold-blooded killers, most received prison sentences of 3 to 5 years. But their real punishment was the knowledge of what they had done and the guilt that would haunt them forever. Sarah Henderson, the first to succumb to Mortis's influence, never fully recovered from the psychological conditioning. Rebecca Walsh, who poisoned her twin son Thomas, struggled for years with guilt while caring for surviving son Timothy. Dorothy Price, who killed her daughter Bridget, eventually found some peace through serving other immigrant families facing similar vulnerabilities. The surviving children faced their own journey of healing. Helen Sullivan grew up to become a teacher, dedicating her life to protecting children. Timothy Walsh overcame his stutter and became a respected community member, though he never forgot his twin brother. David Blackwood, whose testimony helped convict Mortis, became a doctor himself. Inspired by Dr. Morrison's compassionate care, Dr. Morrison coordinated long-term support for the survivors, knowing that healing from such trauma would take years or even decades. He helped establish community support networks, ensured the children received proper education and care, and worked to help the mothers find productive paths forward. The broader investigation as word of Mortis's arrest spread, authorities in other Western communities began examining their own records of unexplained child deaths. Telegraph messages arrived from Sacramento, Nevada City, and towns as far away as Oregon. Reporting similar patterns where traveling spiritualists had operated. The investigation revealed that Mortis's crimes in Millbrook were only the most recent in a decade-long campaign of manipulation and murder. She had perfected her methods by moving from town to town, identifying vulnerable populations, establishing temporary operations, then disappearing before suspicion could focus on her activities. The true scope of her evil may never be fully known, as records from frontier communities were often incomplete and communication between jurisdictions was limited. But evidence suggested that the 8 children murdered in Millbrook represented only a fraction of her actual victims. Legal and social impact. Mortis' case established crucial precedents in American criminal law regarding psychological manipulation and criminal responsibility. It demonstrated that systematic mental conditioning could be just as deadly as physical violence, and that those who manipulate others into committing murder bear full legal responsibility for the results. Law schools began teaching courses on psychological coercion. Medical schools started including content on mental manipulation and trauma. The case became a landmark in developing American understanding of psychological crime and the need to protect vulnerable populations from sophisticated predators. Religious communities also learned important lessons. Spiritualist organizations developed better oversight mechanisms and ethical guidelines. Christian denominations used the case as a cautionary tale about false prophets and the dangers of following charismatic leaders without proper discernment. Community recovery. The town of Millbrook struggled to understand how such evil could flourish in their midst. The sanctuary of eternal peace was demolished within months of Mortis's execution. Its grounds eventually donated for a school where children could learn and play in spaces once haunted by manipulation and murder. Father O'Brien worked tirelessly to provide spiritual counsel to both perpetrators and survivors, though his own faith was tested by the magnitude of evil he had encountered. He developed new approaches to pastoral care that recognized the sophisticated nature of psychological manipulation and the need for community support in preventing such tragedies. The surviving families faced ongoing challenges as they worked to rebuild their lives. Some community members showed compassion, recognizing the mothers as victims of manipulation. Others expressed anger and disgust, unable to forgive women who had killed their own children regardless of the circumstances. 20-5 years later, generation after the tragedy, Dr. Morrison published a comprehensive study tracking the long-term outcomes for all survivors. His research revealed that while all carried lasting effects from their trauma, most had managed to build meaningful lives and contribute positively to their communities. The surviving children had grown into productive adults who married, raised families, and worked to create support systems that might prevent similar tragedies. Helen Sullivan taught school and raised 4 children, always emphasizing the importance of questioning authority and trusting one's instincts. Timothy Walsh became a successful businessman while never forgetting his twin brother Thomas. The manipulated mothers found different paths to redemption. Catherine Mills established a refuge for widows and orphans, creating the support system that might have protected her own family. Agnes Blackwood became an advocate for better law enforcement communication to prevent predators from simply moving between communities. Dorothy Price worked with immigrant families, helping them avoid the isolation and desperation that made her vulnerable to Mortis's influence. Even Sarah Henderson, despite her continued psychological struggles, found ways to help other grieving mothers recognize and resist manipulation. The Memorial Legacy in Millbrook Cemetery. 8 small graves serve as permanent reminders of Mortis's crimes. Each Memorial Day, the community gathers there to remember Mary Henderson, Thomas Walsh, Emma Blackwood, Robert Mills, Bridget Price, Helen Sullivan, whose resistance provided crucial evidence, and to others whose names history preserved. Sarah Freeman and Annie Clark. Father O'Brien, leading annual memorial ceremonies, captured the tragedy's complex legacy. These children died not as victims but as teachers. Their deaths exposed evil that might otherwise have continued unchecked. Their memory reminds us to watch for those who prey upon the grieving and to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit their pain. The final verdict of history. Madame Evangeline Mortis died believing that history would vindicate her actions, that the surviving children would fulfill the dark destinies she claimed to foresee. But history proved her fundamentally wrong. The children she spared from death grew into caring, productive adults who raised their own families with wisdom born from suffering overcome. Timothy Walsh became a teacher who protected and nurtured countless children. Helen Sullivan raised 4 children of her own while dedicating her career to education. David Blackwood spent his medical career caring for children, knowing firsthand how precious and fragile young lives could be. Their resilience, recovery, and determination to build better rather than bitter lives represented the ultimate defeat of everything Mortis stood for. Her prediction of corruption and failure was replaced by the reality of healing and hope, of love triumphing over manipulation, of community strength overcoming individual evil. The lasting lessons. The case of the spiritualist who convinced widows to murder their children became a touchstone for American discussions about the nature of evil, the power of manipulation, and the importance of protecting the vulnerable. It appeared in textbooks on criminal law, psychology, American history, and religious studies. For the people of Millbrook, it remained not an abstract case study but a lived experience that shaped their understanding of human nature and community responsibility. The generation that witnessed Mortis's crimes passed this understanding to their children and grandchildren, creating a collective memory that served as protection against similar predators. 50 years after the events, the last surviving witness, David Blackwood, now an elderly doctor, spoke at a community memorial service. His words captured both the horror of what occurred and the hope that emerged from tragedy. We learned that evil can wear the mask of righteousness, that those who claim to speak for God may serve only themselves, that even the strongest love can be perverted through skilled manipulation. But we also learned that courage can come from the most unlikely sources, that communities can heal from even the deepest wounds, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, ultimately prevails. The ultimate truth, the sanctuary of eternal peace, is long gone, replaced by generations of schoolchildren who play where once Mortis held her deadly sin. The Victorian mansion that housed such horror has been erased, but the lessons learned from its evil remain embedded in community memory. Evil touched Millbrook in 1875, walking among the grieving disguised as mercy and speaking corruption in the voice of divine authority. 8 children died, their mothers were transformed into killers, and a community's faith in basic human goodness was shattered. But from that shattering came renewal. From that darkness came light. From that evil came a deeper understanding of good and a firmer commitment to protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit their pain for twisted purposes. The children sleep peacefully now in Millbrook Cemetery, their names carved in stone and their memory preserved in community consciousness. They died as victims but live on as teachers, their sacrifice serving as eternal warning against the seductive power of false prophets and manipulative evil. Justice was served on June 15, 1876, when Evangeline Mortis paid with her life for the children she destroyed. But the deeper justice, the healing of survivors, the strengthening of community, the prevention of future tragedies continued to unfold with each generation that learned from Millbrook's darkest chapter and chose light over darkness, protection over exploitation, genuine love over its perverted counterfeit. The story stands as testament to both human vulnerability and human resilience, to the reality of evil and the possibility of redemption, to the price of justice and the value of memory in protecting innocence from those who would destroy it in the name of saving it. In the end, love conquered hate, truth defeated deception, and the community's commitment to protecting its most vulnerable members proved stronger than one woman's hunger for power and control. The children who died were not forgotten, the survivors found healing, and the lessons learned continue to protect future generations from similar predators. This is the complete story of Madame Evangeline Mortis, the spiritualist who convinced widows to murder their children, a tale of manipulation and murder, but ultimately of justice served, healing achieved, and hope restored in a community that refused to let evil have the final word.